At some point, without ceremony or warning, there is a faint internal hesitation where there used to be ease, a pause before answering questions that once felt rhetorical because the answer was assumed to be yours to give. A subtle moment when you realize you are no longer certain whether a decision is expected from you or merely tolerated if it aligns with what others have already decided. Nothing has been taken in a visible way. No one announced a change. There was no confrontation, no argument, no moment you could point to later and say that was when it happened. Yet something has shifted, and you feel it most clearly in the smallest moments, the ones that seem too insignificant to defend. What time you will leave the house, whether you should still drive at night. If that trip is really necessary, if that appointment can be moved, if you should eat this or avoid that. The questions arrive gently, often wrapped in concern, but they are no longer questions in the way they used to be. They come with a direction already built into them, a preferred answer hovering just beneath the surface. You sense it when you hesitate, not because you doubt yourself, but because you sense that your answer will be measured, evaluated, weighed for reasonableness, safety, practicality. You begin to hear yourself adjusting, explaining, softening your certainty before it is challenged. This is not the loss of independence people warn you about in dramatic terms. It is quieter. It is a gradual reorientation of where authority lives. The change announces itself not through force, but through politeness, through tone, through the way conversations subtly reposition you from the center of your own decisions to the edge of them. You notice it when someone says we were thinking instead of what do you want, when plans are presented as settled facts rather than open possibilities, when your preferences are acknowledged but not prioritized, noted but not acted upon. You still recognize yourself, still feel capable, still know what you want, but the world around you has begun to treat those wants as optional inputs rather than final determinations. At first, it feels almost flattering. There is relief in not having to decide everything. There is comfort in being looked after. After decades of responsibility, the idea that someone else is watching the details can feel like kindness. You tell yourself this is normal, even appropriate. You have earned rest. You have done your part. You let a few decisions pass without comment because they seem minor, because pushing back would feel unnecessary, even ungrateful. You do not want to appear stubborn or difficult. You do not want to confirm the quiet suspicion that independence at your age is something to be managed rather than respected. So you adapt. You choose your moments. You let some things go. And in doing so, you barely notice that the threshold of what requires your consent is slowly being raised. What once would have demanded a conversation now happens without one. What once would have been a discussion becomes an update. You are informed rather than consulted, included rather than centered. There is a subtle shift in language that accompanies this change. Words like easier, safer, better for you, phrases that sound reasonable and caring, yet carry an unspoken conclusion that your judgment is no longer sufficient on its own. You hear it in the way people speak a little slower, explain a little more, simplify what never needed simplification before. You sense it when your resistance is met with reassurance rather than engagement, when disagreement is soothed instead of addressed. It is not hostility, it is assumption. The assumption that your role has changed, that your autonomy is now conditional, something granted when convenient and withdrawn when it complicates the system others have built around you. The unsettling part is not that others are stepping in. It is that you feel yourself stepping back. You catch yourself asking permission where none was required before, offering justifications for choices that need no defense. You notice how often you say it does not matter, or whatever you think, not because you truly feel indifferent, but because asserting your preference feels like effort you are not sure will be honored. There is a quiet fatigue that comes with having to prove you are still competent, still clear, still entitled to decide. And so you conserve energy by yielding in small ways, telling yourself these are not the battles worth fighting. Yet each small concession leaves a trace, a subtle erosion of internal authority, a growing awareness that autonomy is not something taken all at once, but something that fades as you allow others to practice deciding on your behalf. You feel it most sharply in moments of silence, when you reflect not on what you have lost, but on what you no longer reach for instinctively. The impulse to choose without explanation, the confidence that your answer is enough, the ease of saying no without apology. These were never privileges you thought about when they were intact. They were simply part of being an adult in command of your life. Now their absence is felt as a vague unease, a sense of displacement that is hard to articulate because nothing tangible is missing. You still live where you live. You still wake up to the same routines. You still have access to the same resources. Yet something internal has shifted, and you cannot ignore it forever. There is a growing awareness that the world has begun to see you differently, and that this perception is quietly shaping your own behavior. You notice how quickly concern turns into correction, how easily advice becomes instruction. You notice how often your lived experience is overshadowed by new information delivered with confidence and urgency. You are not dismissed outright. That would be easier to confront. Instead, you are gently redirected, subtly guided toward choices that others deem appropriate. The danger is not in any single instance. It is in the accumulation, the way each moment reinforces the next, until the idea of full autonomy feels slightly out of reach, almost nostalgic. You wonder when it became normal for others to decide what is best for you without fully asking what you want. You wonder when your capacity became something to be evaluated rather than assumed. These questions do not arrive with anger. They arrive with a sober clarity that something essential is being renegotiated without your explicit consent. You realize that autonomy does not disappear through dramatic loss, but through quiet adjustment, through habits formed in response to external expectations, through the slow internalization of a role that asks you to be compliant, agreeable, easy to manage. You sense that the moment people stop asking is not marked by cruelty, but by confidence. Confidence in their right to decide, and perhaps more unsettling, confidence that you will not object. The awareness settles in slowly, like a dimming light rather than a sudden darkness. You begin to see that the shift did not start with others, but with your own willingness to step aside in small, seemingly harmless ways. Not out of weakness, but out of trust. Trust that your dignity would remain intact, even as control was shared. Now you are no longer certain where the line is, only that it has moved. And in this awareness, there is no panic, no immediate urge to reclaim anything. There is simply the recognition that something fundamental has changed, and that understanding this change is the first quiet step toward deciding, internally, what will still belong to you. At first, it feels impolite to name what is happening. You hesitate to call it control because the people involved care about you, because their intentions are good, because nothing about their behavior looks harsh or domineering. It arrives dressed as help, and help is difficult to resist without feeling unreasonable. Someone offers to handle things for you, and you accept, not because you cannot do them, but because it seems unnecessary to insist. Someone double-checks a decision you have already made, and you explain yourself, not because you owe an explanation, but because you want to keep the interaction smooth. Over time, these exchanges begin to follow a pattern. You notice that offers of assistance increasingly come with assumptions attached, assumptions about what you should prefer, what you can manage, what is realistic for you now. The language shifts in small but telling ways. It is probably better if. You do not need to worry about that anymore. We already took care of it. These phrases are spoken softly, often with a smile, yet they carry a quiet finality. The decision has already been made. Your role is to agree. You begin to recognize how concern becomes permission. Permission to rearrange your schedule. Permission to override your choices. Permission to decide what risks are acceptable for you to take. The pattern reveals itself not in moments of conflict, but in moments of efficiency. It is easier for others to decide quickly than to involve you fully. Easier to protect you than to trust you. Easier to frame decisions as solutions rather than conversations. And so gradually, your participation is streamlined, reduced to consent rather than authorship. You are still asked, technically, but the asking has changed. It comes after the decision is formed, not before. It is presented in a way that makes refusal feel disruptive, impractical, even selfish. You begin to feel the weight of expectation in these moments, the unspoken pressure to be reasonable, cooperative, appreciative. You recognize how often you are praised for being easy, flexible, not making things difficult. The praise itself becomes a guide, shaping your behavior more effectively than criticism ever could. You notice how resistance is met not with argument, but with reassurance. You do not need to worry. We know what we are doing. This is for your own good. The phrases repeat, calm and convincing, and over time they begin to sound like truth. You find yourself internalizing them, second-guessing your instincts before anyone else does. You start to ask yourself whether it is worth asserting a preference that will likely be overridden anyway. Whether insisting will create tension you would rather avoid. Whether accepting the arrangement is simply the mature thing to do. In recognizing these patterns, there is a subtle discomfort, not because anyone is acting with malice, but because the structure of your relationships has shifted without being discussed. Authority has moved outward, redistributed in the name of care. You see how routines become tools of quiet control, appointments scheduled without consulting you, plans adjusted for convenience, decisions framed as necessary rather than optional. Each change is small enough to justify, reasonable enough to defend. Together they form a new normal in which your autonomy exists only within boundaries set by others. You begin to notice how often your opinions are met with qualifications. That is a good idea, but you could do that, but the but hangs in the air, signaling where your authority ends. You recognize the pattern in how information is filtered before reaching you, how certain options are not mentioned at all, quietly removed from the table to spare you the burden of choice. This is presented as kindness, and in many ways it is. Yet kindness that removes agency carries its own cost. You start to feel managed rather than supported, included in outcomes, but excluded from processes. The recognition deepens as you observe how easily others speak on your behalf, how quickly they explain your needs, your limits, your preferences, without checking whether they still align with how you see yourself. You notice how often your silence is interpreted as agreement, how rarely anyone pauses to ask whether you are comfortable with the direction things are taking. The absence of that pause becomes telling. You realize that autonomy does not vanish through confrontation, but through accommodation, through the gradual acceptance of a role that expects you to be agreeable, predictable, safe. You see how help, once accepted, creates momentum. Once someone begins deciding for you, it becomes easier for them to continue. The system adjusts around that assumption. To interrupt it would require effort, explanation, perhaps even conflict, and so the pattern reinforces itself. You begin to recognize how language shapes reality, how words like support and care can quietly replace words like choice and consent, how the framing of decisions as necessary removes the space for disagreement. You see how your own behavior has adapted in response, how you anticipate objections and soften your stance before it is challenged. This recognition is not accompanied by anger. It is marked by clarity, a sober understanding of how easily autonomy can be redefined without being openly challenged. You see now that the issue is not isolated moments, but the accumulation of them. The way each decision made for you lowers the expectation that you will make the next one. The way each acceptance teaches others that this is acceptable, even preferable. You recognize how dignity fades not because you are incapable, but because your role has been subtly reframed, from decision-maker to beneficiary, from authority to responsibility. This recognition settles in quietly, altering how you see past interactions, reinterpreting moments you once dismissed as insignificant. You begin to see the pattern clearly now, and with that clarity comes a deeper awareness of what is at stake. Not control in a dramatic sense, but authorship, the right to shape your own life in small everyday ways. The recognition does not demand immediate action. It simply changes how you understand what has been happening. You see that help, when it replaces consent, becomes something else entirely. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a particular weight that settles in once you realize what has been slipping away, and it is not dramatic or sharp, but dense and persistent, like carrying something you cannot set down because you are not supposed to notice it. The loss does not announce itself as deprivation, it arrives as displacement. You begin to feel slightly out of position in your own life, as if the center of gravity has shifted just enough to make everything require a small adjustment. You notice it in the way people speak to you now, with a tone that suggests reassurance rather than exchange, guidance rather than curiosity. Conversations that once unfolded between equals begin to feel directional, moving you toward a conclusion already reached. You are no longer invited into uncertainty. You are presented with certainty and asked to accept it. The emotional cost of this is subtle at first. You tell yourself it is practical, efficient, sensible. You remind yourself that people care, that they are trying to help, that it would be ungracious to resist. Yet beneath these rationalizations, there is a growing sense of diminishment, a feeling that something essential about how you are perceived has changed. You are spoken to as someone who needs managing rather than someone whose perspective matters. You hear it in the gentle corrections, the reminders delivered with a smile, the way your decisions are rephrased as concerns to be addressed. Over time, this alters how you experience yourself. You begin to feel less like a participant and more like a variable to be accounted for. The loss deepens when you realize how this shift affects your internal landscape. You become more cautious in expressing preference, more selective about where you assert yourself. You start to calculate the emotional cost of insisting, weighing whether the friction it creates is worth the outcome. Often it does not feel worth it, so you adapt. You allow others to lead. You tell yourself that flexibility is wisdom, that letting go is maturity. But the feeling persists, a quiet grief for the ease with which you once inhabited your authority. You miss the simplicity of deciding without negotiation, of acting without explanation. You miss being addressed without accommodation, without the subtle assumption that your choices require oversight. The loss is not of ability, but of standing. You still know who you are, what you value, what you want, but you feel those truths carry less weight in the room. There is a particular ache in being spoken for, in hearing your needs summarized by someone else, often inaccurately, yet with enough confidence that correcting them feels like an interruption. You begin to notice how often others anticipate your limitations, how quickly they move to protect you from effort, from inconvenience, from risk. These protections come at a cost. They narrow the space in which you are allowed to operate. They define your identity in terms of what you should avoid rather than what you are capable of choosing. You feel the loss in moments when your opinion is acknowledged but not integrated, when it is treated as input rather than guidance. There is a subtle humiliation in being managed kindly, in being thanked for cooperation rather than respected for judgment. Over time, this erodes something internal, not confidence exactly, but orientation. You begin to feel slightly removed from your own life, as if you are watching decisions unfold rather than shaping them. The routines that once grounded you now feel imposed. The schedules that once reflected your rhythms now reflect others' convenience. You find yourself complying without fully agreeing, participating without fully committing. This creates a quiet internal dissonance, a feeling of being present but not fully represented. The loss becomes most apparent in how you are addressed. There is a softening of language that feels condescending despite its gentleness, a simplification of explanations that suggests reduced capacity. You notice how often people check in not to understand, but to confirm compliance. "Are you okay with that?" becomes a formality rather than a genuine inquiry. Your yes is assumed. Your no is unexpected. When you do resist, even mildly, it is met with surprise, sometimes concern, occasionally disappointment. The reaction itself reinforces the message that resistance is out of character now, that your role is to accommodate rather than to challenge. This affects how you see yourself. You begin to internalize the idea that asserting autonomy is a burden to others, that insisting on your way is unnecessary, even selfish. The loss of dignity does not arrive as insult. It arrives as reinterpretation. Your independence is reframed as risk, your preferences as complications, your experience as outdated. None of this is said outright. It is implied through patterns of behavior, through who speaks first, who decides, who explains. You feel the loss when your life is discussed in your presence, as if you are not fully there. When plans about you are made around you rather than with you. There is a particular sting in realizing that your consent is no longer required to move forward, that it is nice to have but not essential. The emotional weight of this is cumulative. Each instance on its own seems trivial. Together, they create a sense of marginalization that is difficult to articulate without sounding ungrateful. You struggle to name what you are losing because it is not tangible. It is not a right you can point to, not a freedom formally revoked. It is the feeling of being centered in your own existence. The loss of that feeling leaves you slightly unmoored. You begin to question your own reactions, wondering if you are being overly sensitive, if this is simply the natural order of things. This self-doubt is part of the loss, the erosion of trust in your own perception. You begin to defer internally as well as externally, second-guessing your instincts before acting on them. The world seems to expect this of you, and gradually you comply. The loss is not loud enough to provoke outrage, but it is steady enough to cause resignation. You feel it when you stop offering opinions spontaneously, when you wait to be asked, when you tailor your desires to what seems acceptable. There is grief in this, though it is rarely acknowledged. Grief for the version of yourself that moved through the world without this constant calibration. That grief has nowhere to go because it is not socially sanctioned. You are supposed to be grateful. You are supposed to appreciate the care, the support, the attention, and you do. Yet appreciation does not erase the sense of being diminished. You carry both at once. The loss becomes a quiet companion, present in moments of silence, in the space between what you think and what you say. You realize that being managed changes how you inhabit time. You become more passive, waiting for direction, waiting for updates, waiting for decisions to be delivered. This waiting is perhaps the deepest loss of all, the loss of immediacy, the loss of initiative, the loss of the feeling that your life responds directly to your will. You begin to understand that this repositioning is not accidental. It is the result of many small accommodations, many unchallenged assumptions. Yet understanding does not immediately restore what has been lost. It simply clarifies the terrain. You see now how being spoken to differently reshapes your sense of self, how being managed rather than consulted alters your posture, your tone, your expectations. The loss is not just external, it has seeped inward. And acknowledging that is painful, because it requires admitting that something essential has been surrendered, not taken by force, but yielded through habit. There comes a moment, often unnoticed at first, when the weight you have been carrying begins to rearrange itself internally, not lifting, not disappearing, but shifting from confusion into understanding. This is not a breakthrough in the dramatic sense. There is no surge of resolve, no sudden reclaiming of territory. Instead, there is a quiet clarity that arrives once the noise settles, once the emotional reaction gives way to observation. You begin to see that what has been lost externally was never the true source of autonomy to begin with. You notice that while decisions have been redirected, routines rearranged, language softened around you, something else has remained untouched. Your internal posture, the place from which you interpret, consent, resist, or comply. You realize that the deepest form of autonomy was never located in the ability to control outcomes, but in the ability to recognize what you are agreeing to and why. This understanding does not erase the losses you have experienced, but it reframes them. You see that much of what has changed happened because you allowed it to happen quietly, not because you were incapable of preventing it, but because you trusted that your inner authority would remain intact, regardless of external adjustments. That trust was not entirely misplaced. You are still here, still thinking, still aware, still capable of choosing how you respond internally, even when choices are narrowed externally. This realization brings a strange calm, not comfort, but steadiness. You begin to understand that autonomy is not a role others grant you. It is not preserved by insisting on every preference or resisting every intervention. It lives in a more subtle place, in the refusal to disappear internally, even when you are repositioned externally. You see now that the greatest danger was not losing control over logistics, but losing authorship over meaning. Allowing others to define what your compliance signifies. Allowing their concern to dictate how you see yourself. That is where autonomy truly erodes, and that is also where it can be quietly reclaimed. You recognize that while others may decide schedules, manage arrangements, and streamline your participation, they cannot decide what these actions mean to you unless you surrender that interpretation. You begin to notice the difference between cooperation and surrender. Cooperation is conscious. It involves awareness. Surrender is passive. It happens when you stop paying attention. You realize that many of your accommodations were acts of cooperation that gradually drifted into surrender without being examined. The clarity lies in restoring that examination, in staying mentally present to what you are agreeing to, in noticing when help crosses into replacement. This does not require confrontation, it requires discernment. You begin to see that dignity is not maintained through control, but through coherence, through the alignment between what you feel internally and how you engage externally. When that alignment breaks, when you say yes while feeling erased, something inside you tightens. You begin to recognize that signal now, not as a call to fight, but as a reminder to remain internally anchored. You see that autonomy is less about asserting yourself loudly and more about refusing to be redefined silently. This clarity alters how you perceive interactions. You stop measuring autonomy by how often you get your way. Instead, you measure it by whether you remain internally intact, whether you understand the terms under which you are participating, whether your consent is real, even when it is given quietly. You realize that others may continue to decide certain things for you. That may not change, but what can change is your internal relationship to those decisions. You can choose not to internalize the assumption that this makes you lesser. You can refuse to adopt the narrative that compliance equals decline. You begin to see that autonomy, at its core, is an internal position, a stance you hold regardless of circumstance. This does not mean withdrawing or becoming rigid. It means staying conscious, staying authorship-oriented. You stop expecting others to restore what was never theirs to give. You stop waiting for permission to feel dignified. You begin to notice that clarity does not make you louder. It makes you quieter, more selective. You no longer feel the need to assert every preference because you are no longer confusing autonomy with control. You understand that some battles do not need to be fought to be won. Some spaces do not need to be occupied to remain yours internally. This clarity also brings a sober acceptance of reality. You see that aging does change how the world interacts with you, that this is not entirely malicious nor entirely avoidable. You stop personalizing every adjustment. You stop framing every intervention as an insult. Instead, you focus on what remains non-negotiable internally. Your sense of self-respect, your capacity to choose meaning, your refusal to collapse inwardly even when outward authority shifts. You understand now that the most profound loss would have been allowing others to define your worth through their management. That loss has not occurred unless you consent to it. You recognize that internal authority does not require validation. It does not announce itself. It does not demand acknowledgement. It simply persists. You begin to inhabit your life differently, with less urgency to prove, less need to resist reflexively. You become attentive to moments when you are being repositioned, not to stop them all, but to decide consciously how you will carry yourself within them. This clarity brings a kind of groundedness that is difficult to explain. You feel less reactive, less diminished by external arrangements, more anchored in the knowledge that while many things can be adjusted around you, the core of your autonomy remains untouched unless you relinquish it internally. You see now that dignity does not depend on being in charge of every detail. It depends on remaining internally sovereign, on knowing when you are choosing and when you are yielding, on refusing to confuse accommodation with erasure. This understanding settles into you slowly, not as resolution, but as orientation. You begin to move through interactions with a quiet awareness, no longer surprised when others decide, no longer disoriented by being managed. You see it clearly now, and in seeing it, you reclaim something subtle but essential, the ability to remain yourself regardless of circumstance, the ability to choose how you interpret, how you consent, how you exist internally. This is where autonomy truly lives, and it is still yours. Something settles once that understanding takes root, not as relief, not as triumph, but as a steadier internal alignment. You do not announce it. There is no declaration, no moment where you correct others or reclaim territory in any visible way. From the outside, very little changes. Schedules may still be arranged without you, Decisions may still be presented rather than discussed. Concern may still arrive before consent. Yet internally, your posture is no longer the same. You are no longer leaning outward, waiting to be included, waiting to be reassured that you still matter. You are standing inwardly, grounded in a quiet ownership that does not require reinforcement. You notice that you stop rushing to explain yourself. You stop filling silence with justification. When decisions are made around you, you register them clearly, without the familiar tightening in your chest. You understand what is happening, and because you understand it, it no longer defines you. You begin to choose your responses with a new precision. Not every accommodation feels like surrender anymore. Some are simply choices you make deliberately, without confusing them for losses. You discover the difference between yielding and disappearing. Yielding can be conscious. Disappearing is what happens when you stop witnessing yourself. You do not stop others from deciding, but you stop letting their decisions rewrite your internal narrative. When someone speaks for you inaccurately, you notice it without urgency. You correct it when it matters and let it pass when it does not. Not because you are tired, but because you are no longer seeking to be fully represented externally at all times. You understand that your autonomy is no longer something to be negotiated in every interaction. It is something you carry, quietly, intact. You find that you no longer need to prove competence or independence. The need to demonstrate fades when you stop measuring yourself by others' expectations. You do not resist help reflexively, nor do you accept it automatically. You assess it internally. Does this replace my consent, or does it simply assist my choice? That distinction becomes clear now. You notice how much energy was once spent managing impressions, trying to appear reasonable, agreeable, cooperative enough to be respected. That energy returns to you, not as ambition but as calm. You move through conversations without bracing yourself. You allow others to have their assumptions without rushing to correct them. You no longer confuse being underestimated with being diminished. You realize that much of what once felt like loss was the friction of internal resistance, the feeling of being misaligned with yourself. Now, alignment restores a sense of dignity that does not depend on external arrangement. You see that quiet autonomy does not require isolation. It does not require withdrawal or confrontation. It requires clarity. The clarity to know when you are choosing and when you are allowing. The clarity to remain present even when you are not centered. You begin to recognize moments where you once would have gone along unconsciously, and now you pause internally, just long enough to register your consent. That pause changes everything. It restores authorship even when the outcome is the same. You understand that control over outcomes is limited, especially now, but control over meaning remains. You decide what your cooperation signifies. You decide whether accommodation feels aligned or erasing. This internal decision-making becomes your anchor. You no longer feel the need to reclaim every small choice, because you are no longer afraid of losing yourself through them. You understand that autonomy is not threatened by shared decision-making unless you abandon your internal authority. You notice how this posture affects your presence. You speak more slowly, you listen more carefully. When you do assert yourself, it is measured and calm, not reactive. You choose moments where your voice matters most, and when you speak, it carries a quiet weight precisely because it is not constant. You are no longer trying to be managed well. You are no longer trying to be easy. You are simply present, internally intact, no longer negotiating your worth. Others may still see you through their own frameworks. That no longer disturbs you. You understand now that dignity is not something they can give or take. It is something you maintain by refusing to internalize their narratives about decline, limitation, or dependency. You see how many people lose autonomy, not because they are overpowered, but because they surrender interpretation. They allow external management to become internal identity. You do not do that anymore. You remain yourself quietly, even as roles shift around you. You notice that you stop anticipating disappointment when asserting preference. You stop apologizing for existing at your own pace. You stop explaining why something matters to you unless you choose to. This does not make you rigid, it makes you selective. You choose where to invest your internal energy. You allow some decisions to be made without you, because you understand that your self-respect does not depend on involvement in every detail. You refuse the role of the passive recipient, but you also refuse the role of the defiant elder. Neither reflects your internal reality. Instead, you inhabit a quieter space, one where you are aware, consenting, and internally sovereign. You recognize that aging does not strip autonomy unless you allow it to redefine your relationship with yourself. You carry your independence not as a performance, but as an internal stance. You do not announce boundaries, you embody them. When someone decides without asking, you notice whether that crosses an internal line. If it does, you address it calmly. If it does not, you let it go without resentment. This discernment becomes your form of authority. You are no longer seeking to restore the past. You are not trying to be who you were at 40 or 50. You are something else now, not diminished, not withdrawn, simply quieter, more internally anchored. You understand that the moment people stop asking does not have to be the moment you stop deciding. You still decide internally how you will relate to what is happening. You still choose your posture, your interpretation, your consent. That is the autonomy that cannot be taken quietly, because it is not visible enough to target. It does not provoke concern or correction. It does not invite management, it simply exists. And in that existence, there is a calm dignity that does not seek recognition. You move through your life with this quiet ownership, not demanding space, not surrendering it either, just occupying yourself fully, internally, without explanation.